thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video.
Blink 182, Green Day 75. These names are not cool. What's in now is the Strokes, the Vines, the Hives, the White Stripes.
What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock NBA, and I don't know about you, but it has been a difficult couple of years for me. And sometimes I just think, can I just go back to a simpler time? Like, I just wish I could snap my fingers and go back to 2003, when the most important things on my mind were the new episode of the OC and how everyone was wearing those Von Dutch trucker hats. Which also reminds me of what we are here to talk about today, that weird little moment in time when every cool new band was called the somethings, the White Stripes, the Strokes, the Hives, the Vines, and they all look like characters from that 70s show with Rod Stewart haircuts, white belts, and thrift store guitars. And they're kind of cousins, the post-punk revivalists like Interpol, Franz, Ferdinand, and Bloc Party. And for those who don't know, this stuff was absolutely massive. All these bands sold millions and millions of albums. Their big songs were impossible to avoid on the radio, on MTV, even in commercials, and the media was just like tripping over itself to declare these bands the saviors of rock and roll. But then, just a couple years later, it was pretty much gone, like it never happened at all. It kind of came as quickly as it went. And so the question is, what happened? How did this stuff get so big, so fast, and then just kind of go away so quickly? Well, I think I've got some answers, and I will do my best to explain them in this video. So before I get to these bands and what happened with them, first let me just kind of back up and explain exactly what garage rock means for anybody who may not be familiar. Basically, that term refers to all the bands from like the 60s and 70s that played a more raw, stripped down version of rock and roll that was kind of the precursor to what the punk scene went on to become in the 70s and 80s.
Oh, baby, I will travel. I said, if you need a loving, then I'll travel.
And garage rock did have some breakthrough hits. For example, like Louie Louie would probably be the biggest song of the genre. But for the most part, it was just hundreds and hundreds of pretty small bands scattered all over the world, kind of struggling away in obscurity. There weren't really any breakout stars, and so by the time that punk came along, it was pretty much just forgotten. Now, there was a small scene of underground garage rock revivalists in the 80s and 90s, with labels like Sympathy for the Record Industry and Estrus here in Washington, bands like The Mummies, and compilations like Killed by Death. But for the most part, as far as I remember at least, garage rock was really just sort of a footnote to punk that not too many people cared about except for weirdo record collector types that all kind of act like the characters in that movie High Fidelity.
What the fuck is that?
It's the new Belle and Sebastian.
It's the record we've been listening to and enjoying, Barry.
Well, that's unfortunate because it sucks ass.
That is, until 2001, when suddenly, out of nowhere, garage rock, and to a lesser extent post-punk, became the hottest new thing in music. If I had to point to one particular moment that kicked it off, it would be the album Is This It by The Strokes, which came out shortly after the 9/11 attacks. Definitely not the best time to release an album, but still, it pretty much like took over the rock world almost overnight. Last night, she said. If you were around back then, you'll remember this, but if you weren't, to give you an idea of what I mean, here's what Pitchfork said about the album at the time. So it goes with The Strokes, a band that's seen enough publicity in 2001 to make Bin Laden jealous. Touted by the press as the forefathers of a bold new era in rock, the greatest rock band since the Rolling Stones, and the second coming of the Velvet Underground, The Strokes have nowhere to go but out of style, and the album only came out last week. Like, that is how much hype this band had. And to be clear, I think Pitchfork completely sucks, always has and always will, but they are a good barometer for what people with quote-unquote good taste think. And as far as those people were concerned, this album was positioned as like the next Rolling Stones, Beatles, and Nirvana all in one. The White Stripes also broke out that year. They'd actually been around for a few years in that like underground garage rock scene that I talked about before. They were on Sympathy for the Record Industry, but their video for the song Fell in Love with a Girl broke them out of that scene and got them some mainstream attention. I think partly because of the video, which was this really cool like Lego animation thing directed by Michel Gondry, who was doing a lot of cool stuff back then.
said if I need no consider it cheating.
They also got a little bit of a publicity boost by telling the media that they were brother and sister and then acting in like a weirdly sexual kind of way. In reality, as everybody knows now, they were a divorced couple, but it was kind of a funny little troll on their part that people still talk about. The Hives were another one of those 2001 breakout bands. They were on Burning Heart Records in Sweden, the same label as Refused. But they ended up getting some traction over here in the US as well. And also the Vines from Australia, who these days are kind of thought of as a footnote or like maybe a one-hit wonder. But they were super, super hype at the time. It seemed like they were gonna be the next big thing. Like when they were on the cover of Rolling Stone in 2002 for this feature story that really shows what the hype for this garage rock bubble was like at the time. The headline was "Rock is Back," featuring them, the Strokes, the Hives, and the White Stripes, which I find kind of odd considering that just a couple months earlier, that same magazine had Linkin Park on the cover, and that Blink, The Offspring, Limp Bizkit, and plenty of other rock bands were consistently in the Billboard Top 10 around that same time. But unlike pop punk and nu metal, these bands were critical darlings, which is an important aspect that I'll talk about in a minute. There was also Jet from Australia, but they were super, super hype at the time. It seemed like they were going to be the next big thing.
So 1, 2, 3, take my hand and come with me because you look so fine that I really want to make you mine.
And although I personally think it was kind of fundamentally a different thing than the garage rock revival, I'm also going to include all the post-punk revival bands here, like Franz, Ferdinand, Interpol, and the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, because they were kind of lumped together in the press. Again, I don't really think that's accurate, but I'll include it here because that's the way it was thought of at the time. And I wasn't a huge fan of any of this stuff at the time, and I'm still not, but I do understand why it blew up. First of all, these bands just had great fucking songs, plain and simple. It's not my thing personally, but I can recognize that. I mean, there's a reason why these songs are still used all the time in car commercials and stuff, because they have that rare combination of being like edgy enough that you can feel like it's a little bit rebellious and dangerous, but also accessible enough that, you know, your basic Target mom can get into it. And it's full of those huge hooks that stick in your head. Like if TikTok was around back then, you can imagine how many kids would be making stuff with "Are You Gonna Be My Girl?" And in terms of just like the vibe, it was also a refreshing counterpoint to a lot of the other rock at the time. Remember, this was like the peak of nu metal and post-grunge, which was, you know, fairly dark stuff as far as mainstream music is concerned. Like even the more accessible stuff like say Puddle of Mud was really pretty angsty and down, and there's always a place for that, but I think after years and years and years of that, people were kind of ready for a change. And garage rock was definitely that. It was fun, upbeat, high energy music. Like after a hard week of work, you go out on a Friday night, just want to blow off some steam. What do you want to hear? Do you want to hear Wes from Puddle of Mud standing in some grungy, dusty warehouse, whining about how his ex rejected him? Or do you want to listen to Jet, which just like instantly makes you feel like you're at the coolest party on earth? As I have said before, it's kind of an obvious point that I think a lot of alternative rock people miss. People like fun, and this stuff was fun. On the same note, another important aspect was that girls loved this stuff. Not that they didn't also like nu metal and post-grunge, because obviously they did to a certain extent, but I remember this garage rock kind of stuff being really, really popular with the kind of girls who like to go to dive bars and stuff, like cute hairstylists that like to party a little bit more than they probably should. Exactly the kind of girls that if you're a dude in your 20s, you want to hang out with. And again, this seems like an obvious point, but I think a lot of musicians, especially like metal people, kind of don't understand this. I mean, for one, if women like your music, that doubles the potential market for it. And also, wherever pretty girls go, guys will follow. So this stuff worked as like DJ party music in a way that nu metal and grunge just didn't. And you might be saying, wait a minute, what about pop punk? That stuff was huge around then, and it was also fun and upbeat. And you're right, both of those things are true, but pop punk was really for a younger demographic. Like you go to a hipster bar in 2002, nobody's gonna be playing Blink or Sum 41. And so with all of that in mind, it made perfect sense that the garage rock and post-punk stuff blew up the way it did. But at the same time, even as early as 2002, it was starting to feel a little bit contrived and odd that all of a sudden there was this massive wave of bands that all had similar names and all kind of looked and sounded similar that all got popular popular at more or less the same time. I'm not saying that there was any sort of overt conspiracy or anything silly like that, because I don't think that's the case. But I do think there was an element of the critics and rock snobs pushing this kind of stuff specifically because they hated nu metal, pop punk, and post-grunge. Yes, if you look at magazines like Rolling Stone and Spin and NME and whatever, they did put Korn and Blink on the covers because they had to. These were like the biggest rock bands of the time. But if you read that stuff, you can practically feel how much they disliked it. Like how much they didn't want to talk about those bands. Like, oh, can't believe I have to write another story about this nu metal and pop punk crap, but I gotta pay my student loans, so whatever, I guess I'll do it. And you might be asking yourself, well, what did they love so much about this stuff that they didn't like about pop punk or nu metal? I think it's actually pretty simple. This stuff was a call back to all the stuff that those music critic, rock establishment type people consider sacred. All those quote unquote seminal bands like the Stooges, Television, Gang of Four, New York Dolls, and all that kind of stuff. There's actually a term for this mindset that I really love called rockism. Rockism means idolizing the authentic old legend or underground hero while mocking the latest pop star, lionizing punk while barely tolerating disco, loving the live show and hating the music video, extolling the growling performer while hating the lip syncer. Sounds pretty familiar, right? And so in their view, pop punk was fake plastic trash for suburban teenagers, and nu metal and post-grunge were for white trash losers from the Midwest or whatever. But garage rock and post-punk bands, well, they looked and sounded straight out of 1981, so of course the critics love this stuff because that is what they think of as quote-unquote real music. Now, of course, in reality, it's not quite that simple, right? I mean, this stuff was every bit as image-driven as nu metal. Only instead of wearing Janko jeans and Adidas tracksuits, they had skinny ties and Rod Stewart haircuts. And as far as any kind of authenticity or cred goes, well, these bands were part of the same major label system as everything else. Like the Strokes were on the same label as Christina Aguilera. So the idea that this stuff was fundamentally more like substantial or real than anything else happening at the time is pretty much complete fiction and just tells you a lot about how these kind of people think. But at the end of the day, as we all know, the facts just don't matter. These bands were tailor-made for critics and journalists to get behind, and they did. Whether that was part of some deliberate industry push or an organic thing that just happened, I don't know, but either way, it worked. This stuff was absolutely everywhere for a few years. They were all over radio and MTV, they were on every magazine cover, all these bands sold millions of albums, and so in a way, the critics weren't wrong. Like, it did end up being the next big thing. But with all of that being said, the garage rock and post-punk revival was pretty much gone within a few more years. By 2006 or so, it had taken a backseat to the next big thing, which would be like Pitchfork, American Apparel, indie rock. The Shins, Arcade Fire, Death Cab for Cutie, Iron and Wine, all the other kind of stuff that Seth Cohen on the OC listened to, or that you might have heard on the soundtrack to Garden State.
What are you listening to?
The Shins. You know them?
No.
You gotta hear this one song. It'll change your life, I swear.
And I think there's a few reasons why it fell off. Number one was probably just overexposure. Like how these songs ended up getting used in tons of commercials.
Love is the truth. Ba, 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 ba.
Which isn't a bad thing. Like if you can get a payday from putting a song in a Target commercial, by all means do it. But it is kind of hard to feel like you're doing something cool or edgy when you're listening to a song that you just heard in a Nissan commercial. I also think that part of it is that this stuff didn't really have an organic fan base in the same way as nu metal and pop punk did. Both of which kind of grew from the bottom up, whereas this stuff I feel like was a top down kind of thing. And so once the media stopped hyping it and stopped giving it that top down push, it just kind of ran out of gas. Which brings us to the last question. What is this scene's lasting impact, influence, and legacy? Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that this was really the last time that any kind of somewhat aggressive rock was popular with normies. Yes, emo ended up being huge a couple years later, but I wouldn't say that that stuff was really for normies. So if you think about it, unless I'm missing something, bands like Jet and the White Stripes were probably the last time that any kind of music with loud, distorted guitars like like that got that level of mainstream attraction. I mean, yes, My Chemical Romance were huge, but you don't hear them in Target commercials, right? But aside from that, I actually don't think this stuff has all that much lasting impact from a cultural perspective. I mean, yes, everybody knows these songs because they're great and they were super popular, but I don't hear a lot of people citing, for example, like the White Stripes as a big influence. Probably because almost by definition, these bands weren't doing anything new or innovative in any way. It was fundamentally a recreation of the past that wasn't trying to be innovative, right? With that said, I do think that these songs are timeless classics that everybody knows and likes because, you know, what's not to like? I think they were probably also a good entry point for a lot of young kids getting into music because they're fun songs that are kind of kid-friendly. They're also super easy to play, and they were in a lot of the Rock Band games. So there's probably a lot of people out there whose first song they learned how to play was the White Stripes. And to be clear, none of that is an indictment of this stuff. I think it was really good music that wasn't necessarily trying to change the world. And so if the legacy of this genre is just a couple dozen songs that still get played on the radio endlessly, well, there's no shame in that, right? I mean, that's more legacy than most scenes ever have. And who knows, you know, this was almost 20 years ago at this point, and pop culture is very cyclical. So maybe we're due for a garage rock revival. So my advice is start buying your skinny ties now, stock up on motorcycle jackets, start growing out your Rod Stewart hair, and get ready just in case. And thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. I've used Squarespace for almost a decade now for my personal website, and I genuinely think their product is fantastic. You can connect with your audience and generate revenue through gated members-only content, manage your members, send email communications, and leverage audience insights all in one easy-to-use platform. And use their powerful blogging tools to categorize, share, and schedule your posts as well. And they also do e-commerce. Just go to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/thepunkrockmba to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. All right, my friends, that does it for this video. As always, let me know what you think in the comments. Check me out on Twitch if you haven't. Join the Discord. There's a link to both of those in the description of this video. And also, I want to thank my patrons, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Patrons get every podcast a week early. I do giveaways. I do Q&As. There are members-only channels in the Discord that I'm super active in. There's also a way to have me review your music or art or anything else you would like to get my eyes and ears on. So if any of that sounds cool to you, check it out at the link in the description below. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.